The imposition argument is dead. Part 6. The pièce de résistance. It's been boiled down by the antinatalist Poodle Susan to the most atomic level. The imposition argument goes as such. Procreation is the imposition. Procreation does not do the imposing. Parents do the imposing. So let's take a look at procreation is the imposition. I mean, what is procreation other than begetting or generating offspring, reproducing, bringing forth an object, a being into life? And what is imposition? Imposition is a burden, it's an obligation, it's a duty. What is it to impose? To impose is to bring in or into, to put or place, to lay as a burden upon something. But now, is this an equivalence? Is procreation really an imposition? I mean, a cat is a feline, true. A feline is a cat, true. But let's look at a nested identity. A cat is a mammal. True, but is a mammal a cat? Maybe, not necessarily. So perhaps Poodle Susan is trying to nest procreation is imposition into imposition, is putting forth a child into this world and imposition. Well, the world is imposing. You're putting a child into that world, so that is imposing. But she's saying procreation is the imposition. She also says procreation does not produce an undue burden. So why would she say procreation does not produce an undue burden when the identity of imposition is a burden? I believe that she's trying to say that procreation is a burden. So let's look at that as an identity. Is a burden equivalent to procreation? No. Is procreation equivalent to a burden? No. So this is a premises. These are two unrelated things that are put together as an identity, such as saying life is a river, music is poetic. However you want to make a poetry out of your argument, that's fine. But realize, kind of like the way you can use the word imposition in a poetic sense without the term burden, without the burden, is to say like the building is very imposing. That tall building is very imposing. Or the light imposes upon the darkness. You can say light imposes upon the darkness, but that's not a burden upon darkness. That's not a strain or a weight upon darkness. So they would like to use imposition and carry the connotation of burden, carry the definition of burden into procreation. But why do they not use a word like importation? Procreation is importation. I mean, like imposition, there's both part of the definition is in and into, but with import, it's to carry, it's to bring goods from abroad. You're importing them in. This requires a definition that does not house burden in it, because obviously procreation is not a burden. The burden comes from the world. The burden comes from the world. And so when the child is born, the first imposition is the doctor slapping its butt and making it cry and bringing it to life so it can breathe in its first breath. That's the first imposition that comes from the world. The procreation itself is not a burden. Procreation itself is not an imposition. This is the premises, the very poetic premises of the antinatalist. So if you don't agree with this, if you don't agree with this premises, and you hear the imposition argument that life is a burden, that procreation is imposition. Realize that they're being poetic, and they're being poetic because it's a political argument. The antinatalist argument is a political argument against the angst of poverty, of striving in politics, against taxation of government, against the overlords of the world, against the facts of the world that can come and harm us. It's a strain against it, but it is by no means a truth or an absolute truth. And their most atomic premises, procreation is imposition, is false. You don't have to follow it. It doesn't need to be. Keep this in mind. Keep this in mind when you listen to the antinatalist arguments, always talking about imposition. The word imposition does not carry at the most atomic level, and therefore it does not carry at the greater levels, I don't believe. So when you listen to antinatalists such as Gary go on and talk about imposition, they're really talking about the world, what the world is doing to the child after the child is already present. And think about a metaphor to childbearing as making a Geiger counter. Making a Geiger counter is trying to, if the Geiger counter starts going off because it's close to toxic waste or radiation, make that equivalent to pain, suffering, the undue burdens of the world. The Geiger counter starts going up more and more. The more and closer you are in proximity, the greater your fear is of pain, how you navigate in the world to avoid suffering. And it goes off when you are suffering. But keep in mind, the people that produce a Geiger counter do not go to Fukushima or Chernobyl to make the Geiger counter. They're not producing and dumping the Geiger counter in the center of toxic waste. No, not at all. As a matter of fact, they produce a Geiger counter that works, and they might test it like slapping the baby on the butt. They might bring a piece of uranium in and watch the Geiger counter go up. And then they know that the Geiger counter works just fine. Even the person that purchases a Geiger counter doesn't immediately walk into Fukushima. They use it as a detector, just like we use our knowledge and our insight of reality as a detector to stay away from suffering, to stay away from pain, to navigate, to negotiate, to mitigate and marginalize suffering. The piece de resistance is that procreation is not equivalent to imposition. Procreation is not equivalent to imposing. Procreation is not equivalent to burden. And the reverse, burden is not equivalent to procreation. Even Poodle Susan, procreation does not produce an undue burden. Thanks for your time. Please leave your comments below. If you disagree, feel free to comment below and tell me why. Goodbye. One last thing I wanted to say was that somebody might say that the child is forced out via procreation, that the parents conceive the child and the child is forced out, and that forcing out via procreation is an imposition. And to that I'll say that the child is a consequence. It is a cause and effect. The parents are the cause of the child. The child is a consequence of the parents via procreation. But like turning on a lamp and having the light hit the wall, turning on the lamp is the cause of the light hitting on the wall. But the light itself is not forced out to the wall. When the light is turned on, the light just goes out. It permeates out. And like that, when conception occurs, the child is not forced or imposed. It simply grows and permeates and comes out. The imposition argument.